So hello everybody, let's start today's tutorial with some theory. Now, I understand that many of you can't wait to get down to the practical part, but please pay close attention to this and a few other upcoming lessons. I'll be referring to these theoretical videos throughout the course, so please don't skip them, even if you think you know it all. Okay? So I'll try, and I'll be giving simple and brief explanations so that you don't get bored. Once you've understood how light works from a physical standpoint, you'll be able to work in any graphic engine basically. So you'll just have to master some of its basic settings and tools. And as for the rest, it's going to be a walk in the park. So the theoretical part is very important. I can't stress enough how much important it is. Alright, so let's get started. So how does light work in an interior? Now, I've made a drawing to break it down for you. When the light is getting inside the interior through the window and the interior act as a camera obscura. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, you can look up camera obscura on Google, see what that shows you. But for now, suppose you have a box or a room of some kind, and that room has some hole through which the light is getting inside of it. In this case, the light turns upside down. The painters of the past were actively using this method to project a landscape or a portrait onto a canvas, by the way. So it was some kind of a technical know-how, you could say. All right, so why does the light behave like this? What does this give us? In this drawing, you can see the light coming from the sky, and the sky is also a source of light, as it is, and a rather powerful one, by the way. So this light is getting through the window at an angle, and the angle can vary. But the point is that it creates a sunspot on the floor, but the sky is not illuminating the ceiling. So the ceiling is illuminated by the light from the sky and the sun that is reflected from the ground. So it can be a terrace, a balcony, a garden, what have you. The reflected light is getting inside the interior through the window and illuminating the ceiling. And so as a result, the light that illuminates the floor and the one that illuminates the ceiling are slightly different, both in brightness and color. So the light on the floor has a colder shade, while the light on the ceiling is warmer. It can also be greenish or neutral, depending on what there is outside. So there's also the light from the sky along the horizon. It gets inside the interior horizontally, illuminating the room all the way to the opposite wall. As for the sun, it creates this sunspot on the floor. The sunspot might not be there. It won't be there if the weather's overcast or the sunlight is blocked by trees, houses, and various other objects. Or if the sunlight is not getting inside the interior directly. The reasons can be plenty. All right, so we've just seen the key light elements in an interior. It's the light from the sky that illuminates the floor and the light that's reflected from the ground and illuminates the ceiling. And there's also the light from the horizon that gets inside the interior horizontally. Now the light must have a direction. So if a room has symmetrical windows on the opposite walls, the brighter light will be coming from the sunny side, even if we can't see the sun disk itself. So in any interior, the light coming from the window is always the key light, regardless of whether or not we have artificial lights turned on inside the interior. The light from the window, by which I mean the light from the sky and the sun, is the main light that fills the entire interior. Look at the image on the right. There's no direct sunlight, as you can see. But you can still see slight shadows on the wall cast by the floor lamp the table, by the small stools, and various other objects. So by looking at these shadows, you can easily identify the direction of sunlight. This is very important. If the light from the window, which is the key light, doesn't have a direction, objects will lose their shape. They will look flat. And this is true for any interior. Look at this light-colored interior with direct sunlight from the window, for example. Or you can look at this image. You can see here that the light is dull and blurry, but it still has a direction. Either way. So, same goes for dark-colored interiors. So the window is the main source of light. It sets the direction of light. And usually, the light is shining through the window at an angle. And we can see its direction, quite literally. So this area here is illuminated more intensely. As I've said, the floor and the horizontal surfaces tend to get more light. As we move closer to the ceiling, the light becomes less bright because it's reflected from the ground and other objects outside. So in real life scenario, lighting tends to be a bit more complex than in this drawing. The sun is not always shining bright. It can be covered by clouds. Most of the time, actually, the light from the sun and the sky is reflected from exterior objects. And it can be a building nearby or a wall, some trees, windows, and so on. So the light is re-reflected from the ground and then scattered inside the interior, creating soft, directional shadows. The light from the sky comes through the window and illuminates the floor and the horizontal surfaces more intensely than the ceiling. And we can see this effect on the walls right here. As you can see, the lower parts of the walls are brighter than the upper parts. So this is the basic principle lighting scheme in an interior. During our practical lessons, we're going to see different scenarios and methods of light setup. So make sure to remember this scheme. Now here's one more thing. Naturally, a big window is letting more light inside, and thus creating softer shadows. And a bigger source of light always creates softer shadows. A smaller window or a smaller light source creates shadows that are sharper and clearer. So you're unlikely to get soft shadows if your interior has a small window. In that case, the shadows are going to be pretty sharp. All right. So multiple shadows or multiple light sources generate more shadows. Now, here, for example, the shadows are rather sharp due to narrow windows. And also, since the windows are far apart, the shadows are looking in slightly different directions. So make sure to keep that in mind if you're using references or photos. And also, it's crucial to understand that apart from the window that you see in the photo, the interior may have other windows as well, and they'll be letting in additional light. Okay, so now let's talk about the importance of references. So, why should we be using references? Well, the reason for that is that our brain tends to simplify information. And when we try to reproduce an image from memory, we end up with a simplified version in the real image. So, due to the cognitive bias, we tend to remember some things differently from what they really are. And that's absolutely normal. That's why all professional visualizers use references when setting up lighting. Beginners, on the contrary, tend to disregard the use of references. And as a result, they end up with low-quality renders. Plus, they spend more time on their renders. And so, this is why I strongly recommend that you use references. You're looking at a render by one of my students right now. Here, in the upper left corner, we have the reference and then we have the renders that are based on this reference. So if the visualizer was setting up lighting by only using his imagination, well, he might have gotten the same result, but he wouldn't spend more time experimenting, looking for the best lighting scheme. That's for sure. So it's hard to move forward when you don't know exactly what result you want to achieve. So that's why it's best to find the reference and then imitate its lighting in your scene. So you need to pay attention to a bunch of things, such as cold and warm shades, brightness, angle at which the light was getting into the interior, and so on and so forth. So you need to imitate all that as closely as possible. When using a reference, we make fewer mistakes, much fewer, and we get a good quality render that looks realistic and presentable. It's odd how professionals tend to rely on references way more than beginners. If you think logically, it should be the other way around. Alright, now it's time to talk about exposure and dynamic range. So take a look at this image. It's an ordinary photo of an interior, and it was taken with a smartphone or a camera perhaps. It hasn't been post-edited in graphic editors. It's not a collage either. So you see the background outside is highlighted. It's bleached. The interior light is barely visible. The shadows and dark areas are too black. So overall, the entire image looks very contrasting. Now let's see another example. In this one, the camera with which the photo was taken had low exposure, you can tell, a low sensitivity to light. So we can even distinguish some details in the background. We see the blue sky, we see outlines of the clouds, and so on. Now, in other words, the background is well visible, while the interior is too dark. So I've mentioned earlier such thing as dynamic range. The light has a wide range, from a very bright exterior light to a dim, barely visible artificial lighting. Now, in interior photography and interior visualization, we tend to try to achieve a balance between these two extremes. This is when we need to create a collage of overexposed and underexposed photos in order to show the interior in all its beauty. But this is not what I want to talk about right now. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the exterior light is thousands of times brighter than any artificial lighting. And these images illustrate this very well. Take a look at this image. As you can see, camera exposure was set up for the interior. Objects and small details inside the interior are well distinguishable. The artificial lights they're alright, but the background outside the window is overexposed. That's evident. It's much brighter than artificial lighting. So by using collaging and post-editing, photographers create balanced images. And we'll talk about that later. So I've created some basic scenes to show you how dynamic range and exposure work in different graphic engines. So this image was created in Corona Render. For V-Ray, it will be just the same. Now let's see how dynamic range and exposure work in 3D. As you can see, in this image we have sunlight coming through the window. The walls are not overexposed. Here the exposure was set up based on the sunspot. At the same time, the interior is pretty dark. The floor lamp is hardly giving off any light. When we turn off the sun, the image becomes dark, underexposed. So we need to increase exposure, increase sensitivity of our virtual camera, and as a result, the interior becomes brighter. We can see shadows cast by different objects. The sun is turned off, by the way. but the shadows are still there. That's because the window is a sort of light source as well. The floor lamp is now shining bright, and maybe that's because we increased its brightness. But actually no, it's because we increased the exposure, and as a result, the light coming from the window has become brighter, and the light from the lamp also. Alright, so what will happen if we turn the sun back on? Now we can see that it's overexposed, the light from the window is too bright, windowsill and the window opening are totally highlighted. The sunspot is too bright, too bleached. Sunlight is re-reflected onto the walls and the ceiling, making our image overexposed, overburned. Now you know how exposure and relative brightness of environment and artificial light works. Okay, and so finally let's see mixed post-sunset lighting. Now here we only have the light from the sky, and it has a dull blue shade. In this case, our light sources, which is window and the lamp, have the same brightness, but at the same time they have opposite colors. So this is something that's called complementary lighting, when artificial lights have a warm orangey shade while the light from the window has a bluish shade. So this makes image look balanced. All right, now let's talk about reflections. When you're setting up lighting using a reference, make sure to distinguish between reflections on glossy reflective surfaces and light sources. So, for example, if we use the same neutral clay material everywhere in this interior, for walls, floor, furniture, everything, so this highlighted spot wouldn't be there. It's not a light source. It's not sunlight. It's just a reflection from the environment. Now maybe you know this, and there's no need for me to linger on this, but it's not uncommon that visualizers, when setting up lighting based on a reference, mistake such reflections for light sources. And so what they do is they try to imitate them by adding more light to their interior. So make sure you don't ever do that. If you have reflective surfaces in your interior, such reflections are inevitable. All right. So now let's say a few words about exterior background. There's nothing complicated about that. So let's see the most common mistakes made by beginners. The background outside the window must always be overexposed. It must be brighter than the light inside the interior. Why? Well, that's because the background and everything outside the interior is a light source that illuminates the interior itself. The light on the walls and the window frames can be brighter than the light outside. That's just not realistic. So the background outside must be brighter than the interior. That's a fundamental rule. So if the window is big, the exterior light will be less bright. And if the window is small, the exterior light will be much brighter. Why? Well, that's because of exposure. So we've already talked about that. If the window is small, there's less light getting inside the interior, which makes us increase sensitivity of our virtual camera. And as a result, the relative brightness of the background increases. And it works the other way around as well. So if the window is big, there is plenty of light getting inside. In this case, we don't need to increase exposure and make the background brighter. This central image doesn't look very good, by the way. Its background is overexposed, probably due to post-editing. So be careful with your exterior background. Find a reference and stick to it. Alright, so last thing we'll cover today is true physically correct rendering. There's been a lot of discussion both on forums and in chats about how to achieve a physically correct image. the one in which all physical laws are followed to a letter. So let's take a look at this photo. Now, it's a photographer during an interior photo shoot. So we can see softboxes, an external flash, the photographer is moving around the interior, illuminating poorly lit areas to eventually create a collage. Here we see a photo of the interior. It's not a render, it's a photo composed of many shots. Here we see the photographer moving around with the flash illuminating poorly lit spots. He's taking multiple pictures of this interior to eventually combine them together into this collage, this final result. So, if your image lacks light or shadows, and if some areas are too black or, on the contrary, too overexposed, you can always use fake lights to achieve a beautiful result, like in the reference image. Alright, so we'll talk about fake lights in our upcoming videos. We'll talk about whether you should use them at all. And you don't have to worry, we'll be moving gradually, step by step. I'll be explaining to you all about fake lights. Now that's all for today, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. The next topic on our list is lighting contrast. So we've touched upon it in the previous video, but in this lesson, we'll take a deeper dive into the subject. All right, so to demonstrate the importance of lighting contrast in interior and architectural visualization, let me show you a couple of renders that I found on Google. All of them have sort of imbalanced lighting contrast. And these are just some random images from the internet. So you don't have to pay any attention to all the mistakes and flaws in those images. Also, if you happen to see your work, please don't be offended by my comments. Okay, so what's wrong with each of these renders? Let's see. Here's image number 1. Here's the second one. Third. And the fourth image. Now, apart from some questionable design solutions, what do they have in common in terms of visualization? So, I hope you guessed that right, because all these renders have contrast problems. I'm not talking about contrast setup when we open an image in Photoshop and increase its contrast. We won't be able to save these images by simply adjusting the contrast. I'm talking about lighting contrast. And lighting contrast is a ratio between the darkest and the lightest areas of the entire image. It shows how strong the difference between these two extremes is. To make things clear, let's take a look at this render right here. It has a setup lighting. The scene itself is assembled very well, but you get this feeling that there's something wrong with it. And you can see very well that it looks sort of flat and not very realistic. Now, why is that? That's because all light sources in this image affect the overall lighting equally. I've talked about it in the previous video, actually. The fill light coming from the window must be the key source of light in an interior. Once we have the key light, we can add accent lights. These images, on the contrary, look realistic because each of them has a correct lighting contrast. This window here is the key source of light. The light is shining downwards inside the interior at an angle. It illuminates the floor and all horizontal surfaces. We can see shadows cast by the door, sofa, and other furniture. There's light, there's shadow, and half shadow, and this is what makes these images easy to perceive by the human eye. And now let's take a look at a very simple example. So here we have a light source, and it looks like a window, and then we have a kind of cube. And the cube has illuminated face, a half-lit face, and a shadowed face. The cube is casting a directional shadow, and we can easily identify the shape of the object. We can instantly see that it's a cube, but if the light was set up in the wrong way, like this, for example, all the faces of the cube would be equally lit, and it would make it look flat. Now, of course, we can still tell that it's a cube because we can still see its faces, but in a different situation, we would mistake this cube for a hexagon, for example. This is why lighting contrast and a light-shadow ratio is very, very important. It helps us identify the shape of an object. Okay, now let's go back to our previous images, our previous examples. As you can see, there aren't any interior lights here. At least we don't see them affect the scene. We can easily discern object shapes, just like we did with our cube. But here's a question. What if a client asks you to turn on all the lights? For example, if we need to showcase a complex high-tech lighting, and we can't just turn off all the lights in our interior. What are we to do in these circumstances? So we have two options at this point. The first option is to stick with daylighting. So we turn on the interior lights, but in such a way that they don't affect the overall lighting of the scene. Take a look at this image here. Here we have the key light coming from the window, and it has direction. We see clear-cut shadows cast by furniture items, and at the same time, the interior lights are on, and pay attention to these point lights. They're on, but they are not bright enough to interfere with the fill light coming from the window. So if we turn off all of our interior lights, that wouldn't affect the overall lighting at all. But at the same time, we can see that interior lights are on, and they generate slight shadows on the walls. As for the chandelier, it's not affecting the lighting in any way. So that's one way to showcase interior lights without ruining the lighting contrast and making our image look unrealistic. The second option is to set up dusk lighting. In this case, the light coming from the window should have a dark blue shade, like it's after sunset time. So we turn on all our interior lights. In this scene, they're brighter. It's important to balance cold and warm shades. Now, I've talked about it in the previous video. Watch it again if you need to refresh your memory. So here we have correct balance between the cold and warm light, which makes this image so believable and beautiful. Once again, these images don't have mixed lighting. It's daylighting. Interior lights are on, but they are not illuminating anything. In this case, it's only this corner that's illuminated somehow. If we turn off this lamp, this area would turn completely dark. There would be a deep shade there. So turning on the lamp was a good solution. You can do the same if you have a hallway in your interior. Hallways are always dark. In that case, it would make sense to add a ceiling light or a floor lamp to avoid black areas. All right. So once again, you can turn on interior lights just to show that they're there, but they won't be illuminating the space around them. These are different things. If a light is on, it doesn't necessarily mean that it illuminates the interior. It's because the fill light from the window and the interior lights have very different sort of brightness. The difference is thousandfold. Suppose you decide to set up mixed lighting, with the fill light and the interior lights equally affecting the interior. So in this case, the fill light would have a blue shade, while the interior lights would have an opposite color, which is called a complementary color. In that case, you need to keep a balance between the fill light and the interior light. It should be approximately at 1:1. This is how you create a beautiful, well-balanced image. Also remember that there should be shadows in the interior. Make sure the rest of the lights are not too bright. Otherwise, they will eliminate the shadows. The fill light and the interior light should be in balance. We'll go over that again during our practical lessons, both in V-Ray and Corona Render. Let's say a few words about complementary colors. Here's the color wheel. And we see that the fill light that comes from the window and the sky reflected on the floor on one side, and the interior lights on the other side have opposite colors. And so these colors are complementary colors. You shouldn't use just one color for your scene. If the fill light has a light blue shade, you need to offset it with a warm orange light coming from interior lights. All right? Okay, so to sum things up, the light coming from the window should be the key light in your interior. All objects should be casting clear shadows. All lights should have specific direction that you can spot very easily. In the interior, you should only have accent lights that don't affect the overall lighting of the scene. The only exception is mixed lighting. That's when we have dusk, post-sunset light coming from the outside. Okay, well, that was it, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Hi guys, in this video we will talk about histograms. It's going to be a short little video, but never yet very important one. If you know how histogram works, you'll be able to see if your image has correct exposure. I used to cover histogram at the end of the course, but this time I decided to talk about it in the beginning, because it's best for you to learn this as early as possible. Don't worry, it won't be an overly academic lesson with lots of confusing theory. It's easier than you think, actually. So let me try to explain. If we convert an image to black and white, we'll be able to see if our image is too bright, too dark, or well balanced. Imagine that we take each pixel that makes up our image and determine how bright it is on a scale from 0 to 1. From the extreme black to the extreme white. Based on their brightness, we arrange the pixels into stacks. The blackest pixel goes to the left and the whitest one to the right. If a pixel has transitional color, light gray for example, we put it closer to the white stacks. If a pixel is dark gray, it belongs closer to the black stacks. We put the pixels into stacks like coins. Basically, as a result, we get a histogram that looks like this. Basically, it's a chart that shows how many bright and dark pixels our image contains, starting from the blackest pixel and ending with the whitest one. Hope this makes sense. Now, look at these infographics. This thing shows 3 types of images. An underexposed image, that's too dark, see? There is no white whatsoever on the extreme right. White pixels are very few. On the left, we can see lots of dark colored pixels. A highlighted, overexposed image has a different looking histogram. It has a bunch of light pixels on the right and no dark pixels on the left whatsoever. As you can see, there's nothing there but a gap. And so finally, a balanced image with a perfect exposure has information not only in the middle, but also at the edges of the chart as well. Now let's see some practical examples. There's a bathroom that we've seen in the past videos. I used it as an example of a low quality render. Now look at this histogram of this image. The bright area is concentrated here, and it goes all the way up. Now as for dark areas and shadows, there are none. Well, there's a dark patch here at the very edge, but it's very tiny. There is no white in the image either, despite the fact that our interior has light materials. The image looks bleached, which is not good. Here's another image. In this histogram, we see that most information is concentrated on the left. That's because this image has plenty of dark spots and shadows, and the histogram reflects that. Then the chart goes down, and we barely see any information on the right, where light shades are supposed to be. Towards the right edge, the histogram soars again. It's this window made of white pixels. So by looking at a histogram, an experienced visualizer can understand how dark or light the image is. They might even be able to suggest what the interior might look like and what colors and materials it might have. Now let's see a couple of more examples. You probably recognize this interior from the previous video. It would look much better if its main light was coming from the window. We can see that the background outside is too dark, and as a result, the light inside the interior is brighter than outside. That's not the way it should be. The interior background should be overexposed, while the interior should be darker and more contrasting. If this was the case, histogram would have information here on the left, instead of it's all concentrated on the right. Here's another example. Here we have an interior with a dramatic contrasting light, and its histogram looks pretty balanced. We can see the chart spikes on the left because of all of these dark areas. And still, it doesn't go all the way up, except for some patches with the blackest pixels. There's also information on the right. As you can see, that indicates lighter areas in our image. Histogram looks well balanced. Image itself looks good, realistic and contrasting. It's not too white and it's not too dark. Here we have a light colored interior. Let's take a look at its histogram. The chart is shifted to the right. It's because the interior has plenty of light materials. And at the same time, we can see that information is spread pretty evenly along the entire histogram. Now here's another example. This image was sent to me for analysis by one of my students. We corrected the histogram and made this image look more contrasting. I'm not talking about the contrast tool in Photoshop. That's a bit different. So we made it look more realistic and balanced. Some materials must have been distorted in the process, so it's best to adjust exposure in 3D Max instead of correcting overexposed image in Photoshop. So if you do post correction, you should do it in the very end. All right. Now let me show you how you can tell just by looking at a histogram in Photoshop if your image has the correct brightness. Let's take this image as an example. Now, at first glance, it appears to be okay. I can see it's slightly underexposed, but it happens pretty often because of different displays. Some are more advanced with brighter colors, while others are outdated. Looking at a histogram is a surefire way to see if your image has correct exposure. Okay, so we open this image in Photoshop, and then we click Ctrl L to open levels. And here we see our histogram of our image. On the right, we can see a big gap, which means the image is underexposed. There are too few light pixels. So here's what we do. We move the slider where the chart ends and click OK. See? We're balancing the contrast this way. Now it looks fine. There's information at the very beginning and at the very end of the chart. Now let's take a look at an opposite kind of situation where the image is bleached. Let's move the curve to make it wider on purpose. And now we need to make sure that our image still looks okay. So once again, we press Ctrl L and we open our levels. And we can see that a gap is on the left. So there's information missing. So we move the slider at the very beginning of our histogram. And this is how we adjust the contrast. Always look at the histogram of your render to make sure that it looks as it should. Okay, now let's talk about the tools that help us set up a beautiful interior lighting. Now, of course, you already need to have your preferred graphic engine installed on your device. And I'm going to use Corona Render 10 and Vray 6. To activate the graphic engine, we need to go to Render Setup window. You can do that by pressing the F10 key. Here in Render field, select Renderer that you're going to use. If you're using Corona Render, you select Corona, and if you prefer Vray, select Vray. Don't pay much attention to the image. In this video, we're gonna focus on the frame buffer. It's this window where our scene is rendering. We're gonna see the tools that can help us improve our image and make a rendering process easier. We're not setting up our render yet, so don't pay attention to the lighting and things like that. And also don't panic if you fail to keep up. Now there's plenty of information, but you'll have a chance to solidify your knowledge during practical lessons. This video is just a general overview. We're just going to look at the frame buffer settings. Okay, so the frame buffer is this render window. To activate it, we go to the Scene tab. Then we can either click Interactive Render to start it, or we can click Show VFB to display the virtual frame buffer. Okay, so let's go through the Tools panel. First of all, we need to save the current render. It's this Save button here. We do a right mouse click on this corner, and while keeping it pressed, select Save All. This way, we're saving all layers, all render elements. The graphic engine sort of splits the image into different render elements. such as reflections, transparent objects, masks, and so on. So we need to set up these render elements first. We'll look into that later. So once again, to save all render elements, you simply click Save All, or just Save, and there opens a window, and we save all the elements as a graphic file, in JPEG or PNG, whichever you like best. There's also Save CXR. It's a special Corona format that serves all render elements and settings in a single file. So later we can try and open a CXR file with a dedicated Corona viewer. It will look the same as this frame buffer window, and we'll be able to correct your image if we need to. That's very convenient, actually. So next, there's a button that allows us to send our render to the standard 3D Max frame buffer. That's a questionable option to my mind. Some visualizers are using it, but I think that Corona's frame buffer is more than enough for all your needs. So next, you press Ctrl+C. It allows you to copy the current image to clipboard and then open it in Photoshop. Many visualizers do this. Instead of saving the image in an individual file, they send it to Photoshop via clipboard for posting, and that's very convenient. Next, you can refresh the frame buffer or clear the frame buffer to start from scratch. Next, there's a tool panel that pops up on the right. You can either display or hide it. I prefer keeping it open. All right, moving on. Now, about region. That's a very useful tool that we're going to use further on when editing a light spot or setting up a material. If we region select a specific part of the image, it's only this part that will be rendered and updated. And if we region select this lamp and kind of move it around, only this region will be updated. The rest of the image will remain the same. Now that saves you a lot of time because you don't have to wait for the entire image to update. Also, we can use multiple region windows to select a certain area, like this, or close them. Be careful when using this tool though, because it may cause glitches. Corona may freeze. You won't be able to see the section, to see the selection, and it will look like the region is not rendering. In this case, you should keep the right mouse button pressed on this corner and select Remove All or Disable All. See? So I'll remove all the regions real quick. So just keep in mind that it may happen. The next button is Pick. It allows you to pick objects right in the frame buffer. That's another useful setting. We use it when we need to set up a material or shift an object. Let's take this armchair, for example. So we click it, and it gets selected in 3D Max. That means that now we can move this object around and edit it. That's a great setting. Or we can zoom it in and see that an object is levitating, or it's put incorrectly, or needs a material to be assigned to it. So this is when the pick tools comes in handy. Next setting contains render elements that I've mentioned earlier. We can switch between them. I added a new render element. It's called C masking wire, and it looks like this. And I've said that we'll delve into render elements a bit later. So let's go back to the beauty channel. for a moment. It's this main channel where rendering process takes place. Here we have zoom in and zoom out buttons, but we can also use the mouse wheel. Now let's go to the Tools panel and see what we've got there. Let's start with the Post tab. Here we have these drop-down lists. First goes tone mapping. It allows us to edit our image right in the frame buffer. We can change its brightness, contrast, do some basic post editing, and so on. To adjust exposure, we use simple exposure setting. We can reduce exposure to make image darker, or if our image is already too dark, we can increase the exposure. And we can raise it to 2, 3, 10, and so on. So let's stick with the default value. All these values here are default values. Here we have white balance. If the light's too cold or too warm, we can adjust white balance. The lower the value, the colder the image. If, for example, I enter 4000, the image turns cold. We do this if our original image was too warm. And it works the other way around. If it's too cold, we can increase the white balance to, say, 7000 in kelvins. So we enter 7000 and it instantly becomes warmer. The default value was 6500. Okay, the next parameter is green magenta. I personally don't use it. It allows you to shift colors to green or magenta. This can be useful sometimes, but I personally don't like using it. I always skip it. We can select this parameter with the right mouse click and just delete it altogether. Moving on. Contrast is a very common setting. For example, if our image is not contrasting enough, we can increase this parameter. The optimal value is somewhere between 2 and 3. Next we have saturation. I barely use it ever. And then we have this setting, it's called ACES OT. In the older versions of Corona, there was a setting called highlight compression. Then it was replaced with this ACES OT. So if we disable this option, we'll see these highlighted areas. ACES OT tones down these highlights. If these settings are not enough and you want to add some extra post-editing tools, you can click this plus icon right here. And you will see a wide range of extra tools. So we can add vignette, for example. This tool makes the edges of an image darker. Let's make it 2. And now we have the vignette effect along the edges. I personally prefer to add such post-editing effects in Photoshop and not in Frame Buffer. Another useful setting is curves. We use it to highlight dark areas, or on the contrary, render highlights darker. We unfold a chart with a curve, place a point here in the center. Okay, so we need to highlight the dark area in our image. In one of the past lessons, I was telling how this histogram works. On the left side, we have the dark areas of our render. So let's raise the curve to make them lighter, to make the highlights darker. So we'll lower this part of the curve. If you don't need this setting, you can just disable it. Another parameter is called filmic mapping or advanced filmic mapping. I can't say I'm using it very often, but it serves to adjust highlights and shaded areas. In other words, it's used to fine-tune the contrast of an image. I personally think that if we have to heavily change these values, this means that the light in our scene is set up wrong. If your light is set up correctly, you don't have to do lots of post-editing, including through curves. So make sure to keep that in mind. Now, if we have strong highlights caused by the light coming from the window, for example, we can correct them with Reinhardt highlights compression. It's a classic highlight compression method. Only difference is that it works a little differently. In older versions of Corona, this parameter varied from 0 to 10, and now the default value is 1. So we can gradually increase it, 1.5, 1.7, 2, at 2. The compression is too strong, and that makes our image losing its contrast. So make sure to use it carefully. Now, some visualizers use LUTs. It's preset color correction and contrast settings in the format supported by Photoshop and many photo cameras. You can download and use these ready-made settings. They each have a codec and other parameters. Each LUT gives a certain shade to your scene. If its effect is too strong, you just need to reduce the opacity of this particular LUT. Alright, that was it for basic image correction. The rest you can do in Photoshop. The next tab has bloom and glare post effects. They serve to create glare effects generated by the light from the window. For example, here we can't properly see that because our window is not illuminated enough. And by the way, let's delete these correction layers. Okay, so bloom creates a soft highlight coming from the window. Let's set it up. Let's change its intensity to 3 and see. Certainly gives a stronger effect. Now let's increase the size of the spot to, let's say, 30. And make sure to use these bloom and glare effects with moderation. As for me, I barely use them at all. Let's move on. Now, glare is basically stars. If you have a bulb, a point light, you can enable the glare effect with stars. And we'll cover this in our video on point lights. But if you ask me, I'd apply these effects in Photoshop. Here we have various settings for bloom and glare effects. We can change the number of streaks and glare stars, or we can adjust camera aperture. So it's like imitation of a real camera, basically, with a certain number of blades or slides. Maybe 6 or 8, and so on. So these settings also affect the bloom and glare effects. But again, it's best to do that in Photoshop during post-editing. Alright, now the last parameter is sharpening, blurring. That serves to adjust the sharpness, as the name suggests, and it's also best to be done in Photoshop, because the values you see here are default values. Blur effect is at 1.3, and the image looks rather blurry. So let's bring it to 0. Next, we have sharpening. If we increase this parameter, our image becomes very sharp. Once again, you can easily do that in Photoshop. And why Photoshop? Well, that's because it's easier to do these things in Photoshop. if you have to render your scene, you'll have to deal with artifacts. So it's always best to do that in post-editing and Photoshop. So I recommend using frame buffer for basic settings only, such as exposure and contrast, for example. Okay, now let's move on to the last tab. It's called denoising. First, we need to activate it in the render setup window. Denoising allows us to remove noise from the render, and we'll delve into denoising later. And also make sure to use this with moderation. If your image is too noisy, you're unlikely to improve it through denoising, and you'll end up with a blurry image. Denoising must be used carefully. Almost shouldn't be used at all. So the same for radius. It can save you some time, but not always. If your image is a bit too noisy, you can apply denoising. To enable it, you go to Scene, go to Denoising, and here the default parameter is none, so we select Corona High Quality. Amount is 0.4. Radius is 0.4 as well. So these are universal denoise values that fit any scene. All right, good. So we've touched upon denoising too. That's perfect. Now let's examine the rest of the tabs. Let's go to Stats. Here we see rendering time, denoising time. Also, there's a stat called noise level. As you can see, at the moment, it's set to 1.28%. The optimal noise level should be around 3%. That depends on your project, of course. For an exterior scene, the noise level can be at 4%. We'll focus on the noise level later on. You will also learn how to reduce it. But anyway, make sure to check the noise level while your scene is rendering. Let's move on to the next tab. So the next tab is History. So when we're making adjustments to our scene, it's nice to be able to see how it changes. So here we can observe how it's changed. At this point, we can delete the previous image, for example. Let's delete previous images. And we can save our current render. So we click Store Current VFB. Here's this image. Now let's make some changes. Let's reduce exposure and make it darker, like this. Now we want to compare before and after. So we go back to History, click Store Current VFB, and save another version to render. And now we can compare the two versions. I click one image with the left mouse button and the other one with the right mouse button. And we've got A and version B. Now by moving this slider, we can compare these two versions. To delete these images, we simply click Clear AB. To delete all history, delete all. And that deletes it all. And then we have DR. That's distributed rendering. That's when a scene is being rendered by several computers. But this is obviously not our case. Finally, the last tab is Light Mix. We'll dedicate an individual video to this setting, and I'll show you how to set up light without noise and how to avoid common mistakes when working with Light Mix. As for now, let's skip this step. So I guess that's it. The stop button here serves to stop the interactive render. To restart the render, you do a right mouse click on this corner here, and while keeping it pressed, click Start IR. The render button is a slightly different thing. Interactive render reacts to any changes made to the scene, such as moving around an object or changing a material. See? I moved this chair and that updated the render. But if I want to do the final render, we need to stop interactive and click render button. In that case, the scene will load and start rendering. Okay, what else? Now, when making final adjustments to your scene, you need to click render, not interactive render button, mind you. That's because interactive has its limitations, a lower resolution, for example. So the final render, make sure to use render button. Okay, folks, that's all I wanted to tell you about the frame buffer in Corona Render. We'll see you next time.